Today we are going to speak about John Keats. John Keats, not the first, but probably the greatest, and definitely the purest of all romantics. In him, we find a romanticism that has already been purified and distilled. Before him, there were great poets, even within the realm of English romanticism, especially William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge. In fact, John Keats and Samuel Coleridge, if they were not close friends, at least they got to exchange some of their ideas. But that romanticism that had been started and taken to a high point by the initiators was distilled and was refined by John Keats, to the point that in John Keats we find probably the purest romanticism ever. And this is a pure romanticism. When we speak about the first phase of romanticism, it's a luminous romanticism. Eventually, we are going to see also how the dark romanticism unfolds, and we all have everything contained virtually in the Sorrows of Young Werther. But let's focus now on this luminous phase of romanticism and how this is represented in the life and especially in the poetry of John Keats. I'm going to speak about his life, but not very, I'm not going to delve too much into his life, because that's something that you can find in any biography. But especially I would like to see his life like the background where his poetry evolves and comes to this high purity standard. He was born on the 31st of October, 1795 in London, England. He was the oldest of four siblings, four children. John, then George, Thomas, and Fanny. That's the name of John Keats and his three siblings. His father was wealthy, and it's likely that his father married. We know little about their family history, but it's likely that his father, Thomas Keats, married the daughter of his boss to continue the business, which was a very successful business, and that gave him enough resources. And he attended classical school, maybe not the best, but a significantly good school, where he specialized in the classics and in history program. However, tragedy would strike when he was 8. In 1804, his father Thomas died. He had gone to visit him at school, him and his brother George, and on his way back, he fell off his horse and died. As a consequence of that, some have speculated that maybe he was drunk, so he could have been at fault, but those are mere speculations. And the point is, he died, and his mother was not able to take care of the business. She married, and her mother's mother, meaning John Keats' grandmother, was not favorable to this marriage because they saw this man as an opportunistic, and maybe that's what he proved to be. Anyway, when he was 14, when John Keats was 14, his mother also died from tuberculosis. That would be the disease that would take John Keats to his grave, as well as his brother Thomas. When he was 15, being an orphan, although he was under the care of his grandmother, he began his studies as an apprentice of an apothecary and a surgeon. Maybe this would have opened a successful career as a physician, as a doctor, as a medical doctor, but we know that he dedicated himself to poetry. Nevertheless, this experience of working as an apprentice for an apothecary opened him to a very close-handed experience of human suffering. In those times, there were no anesthetics, and surgery had to be done on live flesh. So he must have seen that actually his room was on top of the surgery chamber. So it's likely that while he was not studying, he could hear the shouts and the screams of the patients who were suffering from some ailment, and how the surgeons had to perform those operations. In addition, this also familiarized him with medical terms that you can also see in his poetry. Of course, they are not scientific treatises, but he blends them in, I would say, perfectly within his poetry. My heart aches. Some opiate, or I had emptied some opiate to the drains. So there are lots and lots of medical terms in his poetry. And of course, this comes from his experience as an apprentice. He began writing poems, but not much survives. His earliest poetry dates to 1814, when he was 19. And 2 years after that, when he finally got his license to practice as an apothecary, he decided to dedicate himself to poetry. And it was then when we have his first published sonnet, 1816. It was a sonnet that his friend Leigh Hunt, who was also a friend of Wordsworth, a friend of Shelley, and a friend of Byron, had this poem published. It's a sonnet. It's called O Solitude. That was his first published poem. And that motivated him to write his first book of poems. And the title is very simple. It's Poems by John Keats. Poems by John Keats. That was his first complete volume published by the editors Charles and James Ollier. This was a literary failure. It was harshly received, it was very criticized, and it was torn to pieces. And his publishers felt ashamed, and eventually he would undertake an even larger poem, which is called Endymion. Endymion. From the preface, he says that he wanted to write a 4,000 line poem. 4,000 line poem. So it was a long poem. And whom was he thinking of when he wanted to challenge?
Homer?
And closer to his times, Milton. Milton. In the preface, he uses the word training over and over again. So he's training himself. This is a test where he wants to challenge himself to see if he can exploit a theme and an argument to the point where he can write 4,000 lines on this poem. He also asks himself, did great poets ever write only short poems? So he was challenging the great poets, especially Milton, but of course not only. This is Endymion, and it was also harshly attacked. They called it Cockney school. Cockney, which was a pejorative term to describe this kind of poetry, and the critical reviews said this poem was nonsense, that he'd rather give up writing and dedicate himself to something else. Nevertheless, let me quote you something from the preface so you understand what was his intent, what he wanted to achieve with this poem. In the preface, he says, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass. It will never pass into nothingness." He wants to exalt beauty. And here we see how his romantic intent is crystallizing and becoming more and more vivid. He also longs for a life of sensations rather than thoughts. Imagination prevails over logic. And imagination is a safer and clearer path to lead us to wisdom rather than reason. And of course, this dichotomy had already been presented by poets before him. Remember the poem we read by Goethe, The Erlking. There we find that tension between the imaginary and the logic realm, or the imagination between the realm of dreams and that of reason. What is particular about John Keats is that he acknowledges this dichotomy, but he completely shifts toward one end of this tension. He's very aware of the logical realm. It's not like he's irrational. He knows there's that realm of reason and of everyday life, but he prefers and he longs for that imaginary realm. And it was also in that time when he met his new publishers, Taylor and Hesse, and it was a great move of trust in him because he had been so harshly criticized that it was not easy for a publisher to invest his money in a poet that had been so harshly criticized. Just like in our days, they needed to make money. So will this poet make us successful in our publishing business? So that was a question. And not only did they have to trust him, but they paid him in advance for his next book. And it was a great confidence they had in him. Preparing himself for this poem he would write, in the summer of 1818, he toured in northern England and Scotland. With whom? Samuel Coleridge. And in those conversations, they spoke about metaphysics, they spoke about nightingales, they spoke about poetry. So he was mentored by Samuel Coleridge. And when he came back from that trip, his brother was already ill with tuberculosis. So he spent the remaining of 1818 tending to his brother, Thomas, who died in December of that same year, 1818. Back then, tuberculosis was not known to be contagious, but it was then when he himself also contracted tuberculosis. However, this started his annus mirabilis, his great year. And it is in this year when he produced his most renowned poems and his purest poetry. You see now how his poetry had started as some kind of flow, everything within the line of the Romanticism that had preceded him. Yes, you see how he was mentored by Coleridge. You see how he also, to some extent, imitated Wordsworth. But after he had received such a harsh criticism, that refined him. And his poetry got detached of everything that could be criticized or deemed as obsolete. And it was then when his poetry distilled and became very pure and very crystal clear. For example, during the course of that year, he wrote 5 of his 6 great odes. Most of them, you have them in the anthology. Don't try to find cohesive thought in those odes. Meaning, how does John Keats grapple with the struggle between imagination and reason? That's a question, but that question remains open. And if you read Ode to a Nightingale, you will see, okay, yeah, sure, he says that poetry, symbolized by the nightingale, is immortal and everything else passes. So that's his solution. But then you read Ode to a Grecian Urn, and you see that his response is a little different. So we have to know that beauty is transitory. And that's what makes it beautiful. Because if it stays there forever, then it loses some of its value. We are lucky to be alive, unlike the paintings on the Grecian urn, because they seem joyous, but they never achieve that fullness of joy. So that's a completely different outlook. That's a completely different perspective on the problem between beauty and imagination, or on melancholy. Those are different approaches. Both of them, all of them, are very profound. They all are very reflective, but don't try to find a coherent line of thought in all of them. Those are just different approaches. Yes?
Do you know what Grecian urn might have inspired him to write that ode?
There are lots of studies about the Grecian urn. So I'm pretty sure we know which particular Grecian urn inspired him, but even if we don't, it's very clear to, it's very easy to trace back what he was seeing on the Grecian urn, because the first 3 stanzas deal with one side of the urn, and the final 2 on the other side of the urn. Yes. And something that is remarkable about John Keats is precisely his sensitivity. His sensitivity. A soul that has no depth, or has no training, or has no education, goes to the Yale Art Gallery, sees a Grecian urn and says, okay, and moves on. Listens to the song of a nightingale, okay, and moves on. Have you ever listened to a nightingale? It's a chirping. And what's marvelous to me is that chirping could inspire such a great ode. Likewise, it's awesome to see how standing before a Grecian urn, he draws so much content and so much inspiration, and he can produce these great odes. In autumn 1819, he himself was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he refers to this period as his posthumous existence. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, John Keats, the great romantics, died young. What was remarkable about John Keats is that he knew he would die young, unlike Lord Byron and Shelley. So he refers to the time that he had to live after the autumn of 1819 as his posthumous existence. Yes, is there a question over there?
Yes, Doctor, I want to know your opinion as Doctor of Philosophy, well, Professor in Humanities. What's your opinion about the logic and the relationship between the logic and the imagination?
So the question is, what's the relationship between the realm of logic and the realm of imagination? That's a very interesting and extensive question. Let's focus now on John Keats. In John Keats, definitely the realm of imagination prevails. And it is there where we can escape. We can escape from the realm of logic. We can escape from the weariness, the fever, and the fret. And since you memorized the soliloquy of Hamlet, you will find some connection that John Keats used as a copy-paste for Ode to a Nightingale. So in him, we find definitely a soul that is very aware of these two realms, and of the tension between the two of them. And you could say that his poetry is a quest to release this tension. But he actually never achieves that goal. And that is one of the great achievements of John Keats, that he never gets there. Why? Why am I saying this? Unlike Samuel Coleridge, who was a philosopher and a theologian, and just like a side note, he was a poet. At least that's the way he regarded himself, even if posterity has regarded Samuel Coleridge as a poet. He regarded himself as a philosopher and a theologian. Why Samuel Coleridge was not able to produce poems like those of John Keats? According to John Keats, that's because he lacked negative capability. What is negative capability? It's the ability to stand in front of the mystery without trying to explain it. Samuel Coleridge, as a philosopher who gave most of his attention to that of logic and even tried to fit the realm of imagination into his logical categories, would have never been able to stand before the mystery without explaining it. John Keats doesn't explain it. He just wrestles with the mystery. And I think there John Keats has a very good point, because let's think a little about philosophy. You have Kant with his great work, The Critic of Pure Reason and The Critic of Practical Reason. So when we approach a theoretical problem, we have pure reason acting. When we approach a practical problem, we have our practical reason, and that's clear, right? But what's his other great work? The Critic of Judgment. When we listen to Mozart's Requiem or read The Sorrows of Young Werther, is that something we can fit into our logical categories? When we fit it into our logical categories, or when we try to explain it out, we miss out on the richness that it entails. So in John Keats, we find someone who explores profoundly, I would even say exhaustively, that tension, and he always escapes into that realm of imagination. A lot more could be said about this, but I think that this opens the avenues to explore and to delve into the problem, and I think it also sets a clear grounding for you to continue delving into these difficulties. So this became his most fruitful period. It is then when he wrote An Ode to Melancholy, An Ode to a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale. And as he sank into depression, he also wrote The Eve of St. Agnes. I'm going to read you an ode, sorry, not an ode, a quote from one of his friends. In the spring of 1819, a nightingale had built her nest near my house. Keats, who was staying with him, Keats felt a tranquil and continual joy in her song. And one morning he took his chair from the breakfast table to the grass plot under a plum tree, where he sat for 2 or 3 hours. When he came into the house, I perceived he had some scraps of paper in his hand, and these he was quietly thrusting behind the books. On inquiry, I found those scraps, 4 or 5 in number, contained his poetic feelings on the song of the nightingale. You can see that it was probably then when he wrote Ode to a Nightingale. However, this seems too convenient. It might be construed, because we already know that even before that, Samuel Coleridge and John Keats had exchanged their ideas regarding nightingales. So if we think that this ode was born under a plum tree in 2 or 3 hours, we might be mistaken. It might be that it actually happened this way, but I personally think that this ode is the process of a very refined search. I don't think, maybe the outburst of inspiration came in a single moment, but he had to refine it. He had to crystallize it. He had to think over the words. But there are many papers written about Ode to a Nightingale. Many of them regarded as the greatest short poem ever written in English. I also read a very interesting study that compares Ode to a Nightingale with Hamlet's soliloquy, and gives preference to Ode to a Nightingale precisely because its metapoetical value and because of its imagery, which is way superior than that of the soliloquy. Although there are many common elements. Hamlet, it's like 23, so is John Keats. Hamlet's soliloquy happens over the night, so is the case with Ode to a Nightingale. So it's not like I have on the top of my mind now all of the elements that compare one with the other, but I've also explained the weirdness, the fever, and the fret, which is a copy-paste from Hamlet's soliloquy. So there are so many elements that align. Of course, the reflection about death. That it's impossible to disregard the influence of Shakespeare in John Keats, although it can also lead us to ask ourselves, to what extent did John Keats surpass the influence he had received from Shakespeare? Infected with tuberculosis, his doctors advised him to leave England to warmer weather, and he moved to Italy. However, that helped, but it was not enough. So he died in February of 1821, a few months before his 26th birthday. He died aged 25. And let me read you a quote from his epitaph. He wanted his epitaph to be very simple. He wanted his epitaph to say only these words. I'm going to read it to you. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. Do you get it? What happens if you write something on water? It vanishes, it fades. So here lies one whose name was writ on water. That's what he wanted his epitaph to say. However, his friends expanded it a little more, and this is what his actual epitaph, which you can see in the cemetery in Rome, this is what his actual epitaph says. This grave contains all that was moral of a young English poet who on his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart, at the malicious power of his enemies, desired these words to be engraved on his tombstone. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. 24th of February, 1821. Was there a question over there?
What is the perspective of the Romantics on religion?
It's a very broad question because we have to see which Romantic. The question is about their views on religion. And some of them were atheists and confessed atheists, like Percy Shelley. I think Lord Byron too. I'm not sure if Lord Byron declared himself as an atheist, but definitely Percy Shelley, who would be Mary Shelley's husband. He would give her her name, her last name. He was a confessed atheist. With Samuel Coleridge, definitely we find a theologian. So he had his own views on religion, and I think he regarded himself as a theologian. With Goethe, we already saw that he started his own religion, right? And he ended up believing what he had, and he ended up believing, and he died as a faithful believer in the religion he himself had brought together. Giacomo Leopardi, whom we will see shortly, is also an atheist, whose atheism is quite particular because he never contends or argues about the existence of God. His atheism is deduced from his silence. Since he never mentions God, it's made his silence ends up being too eloquent. So that's a particular type of atheism we find in Giacomo Leopardi. Instead, in Becker, we find a romanticism that has crystallized within the folklore and the culture and the traditions of Spain. Remember that romanticism also has a very powerful nationalistic taint. So Spain and Spanish culture can hardly be detached from Catholicism, at least in the 19th century, when Becker was writing. So you see that in Becker's poetry and in his legends, there are lots of allusions to Catholicism. You could say, well, that's a traditional view, and it's just as part of the folklore, but definitely he cannot disregard it. So the question about the religious views of the Romantic movement are way too broad. Okay, for example, Victor Hugo, who's also an author of transition, and with Victor Hugo we are already stepping into realism. What are his last words in his own testament? I believe in God. Mm-hmm. So it's a very broad question. We have to focus on particular romantics. In addition, a single author can also change his mentality throughout time. And with Victor Hugo, you find that transition from being a Catholic and a monarchic and a believer, and then he transitioned to something else, and then he ended up, well, believing in his own God. So it's a very broad question. But did I set the grounding for an answer to your question? Good. I've left unnamed his life's love, who was Fanny Brown. Fanny Brown, whom he met while he was tending to his brother Thomas. During his brother's last illness, he met Fanny Brown. It's maybe not a coincidence, although it might be a coincidence, but his sister's name, with whom he got along very well, was Fanny, and his mom's name was Fanny. So maybe this name had a particular resonance in him, and he got along very well with her. It's likely it is for her for whom she composed the sonnet Bright Star. Bright Star, yes, I think you have it in the anthology too. To her, he wrote, by the way, besides his poetry, you have also a huge epistolary, and it's incredible to see the legacy John Keats left behind. I was going to say in 25 years. Actually, no, in 5 years. Because remember that his earliest surviving poetry comes from 1816. He died in 1821. So in those 5 years, he bequeathed a legacy that positions him among the greatest romantics who ever lived. And it's impressive that he achieved all of that in 5 years. So, from his letters, I have two luxuries to brood over my walks, your loveliness and the hour of my death. And in another letter he also wrote, my love has made me selfish. I cannot exist without you. I am forgetful of everything but seeing you again. My life seems to stop there. I see no further. You have absorbed me. I have a sensation at the present moment as though I was dissolving. I should be exquisitely miserable without the hope of soon seeing you again. I have been astonished that men could die martyrs for religion. I have shuddered at it. I shudder no more. I could be a martyr for my religion. Love is my religion. I could die for that. I could die for you. So I think John Keats is answering your question about his religiosity. Yes. In these 5 years, John Keats left a monumental legacy that positions him, at least in my opinion, as the purest romantic. Because, for example, Walter Scott, he tells stories to build a national legacy. William Wordsworth, he writes to reform poetry. Percy Shelley, he tries to bring in moral reforms. Lord Byron, he advocates for political independence. Samuel Coleridge, that's an intellectual quest. So they all have an agenda. You can attach an agenda to each romantic. Every romantic has an agenda. John Keats' agenda is none other than worshipping beauty. Worshipping beauty. Beauty that can be understood as love, or that can be understood as nature, or that can be understood as art. Don't try to find a coherent understanding of all three of them, but his intent, his only goal, is to worship beauty. And here lies one whose name was Reading Water. I think he died without knowing he was going to be renowned as one of the greatest poets. I think he was not aware of he was not aware of the legacy he would leave behind. Nevertheless, he knows that poetry will endure. And he sees himself just like one more note in the symphony of poetry. If that note is going to be stressed or highlighted or is going to be disregarded, he couldn't care less. Because his only goal was to worship beauty. And that was his whole romantic endeavor. Love, art, beauty, and seeking art for art's sake. Contemplating his own heart. Escaping to the realm of imagination. That's what he tries to achieve through his poetry, and he very successfully achieves it. Leaving the world to explore the mystical or aesthetic realm, melancholy is an integral part of experience, which must be accepted willingly as an inevitable element of life. He is dominated by this attempt to escape the world of human suffering into an infinite, superior domain in his own imagination. Art versus Reality in John Keats by Smruti Samal. I'm quoting one of the studies I read. And let me bring you here another quote from Bari Khan. It's a stylistic analysis of Ode to a Nightingale. Keats' poetry creates a dreamlike, deceptive world through which the reader not only temporarily escapes from the threats of the reality, but he also experiences a moment that lifts the reader's mind to a higher level of tranquil meditation. Keats' concept of healing power of poetry can be well perceived in his odes. According to Keats, great poet should write poetry that soothes the soul. He dedicates himself to exploring the mystical and the aesthetical realm. He explores his own heart. He explores the realm of imagination, and he does not explore it with reason. So he does not try to fit it into some logical category. It's common among romantics to flee, to escape toward nature, to escape to the past, to escape to ancient Greece, or to the Middle Ages, or to ancient Rome. The very term romantic, Roma antica, meaning ancient Rome, comes from that attempt to escape. So escaping is a commonplace among romantics. And John Keats achieves it to a very high degree and with no attached agenda. He's aware that in our world, nothing lasts forever. So that is his constant quest, that is his constant struggle, and he tries to bring together that tension between the realm of logic and the realm of imagination. And there's a contrast between the fleeting and the troubled world of human suffering on the one hand, and the other world, which is the art of beauty, which is the world of art, which is the world of beauty. That is immortal and that is unchanging. It never changes, like the song of the nightingale. That is why he refers to ancient times like the times of Ruth. Ruth listened to the song of the nightingale. And in our days, we can listen to the song of the nightingale. Belinda Jacks from the Oxford University, she gave a conference on John Keats, and she was so thorough that she went to the Department of Zoology and asked if we knew how nightingales sang back in the 1800s. And if we can trace it back to thousands of years. And it's likely that the song of the nightingales has not changed. Or if it has changed, over the course of time, it has changed very little. The point John Keats wants to make here is the song of the nightingale is unchanging. And all ages, all generations will listen to it just the same way it is. And who will listen to this song, which is a symbol of poetry? Who will listen to it? The emperor and the clown. No matter how low ranking or how high ranking you are still going to listen to the same poem. Keats wants to give himself to all generations to come. Or let me rephrase, he doesn't want to give himself. He wants to give his own poetry, like that lasting testament. Because art transcends life and death. Thank you.